Every night at exactly 11:15, the whispers began. Prisoners at Cinder Hollow would press their ears against the cold stone walls, listening to confessions of murders they never committed, thefts they never planned, and secrets that could destroy the most powerful men in Illinois. What they didn't know was that these weren't the voices of ghosts. They were the echoes of their own tortured words, recorded and replayed through a network of pipes that turned their suffering into political ammunition. But before we uncover the horrifying truth behind these midnight confessions, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's most chilling secrets. Give this video a like if you're ready to dive deep into the shadows of our past, and let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow mystery lovers around the world. Now, let's step back into the winter of 1872, when the truth about Cinder Hollow was still buried beneath layers of corruption and fear. According to fragmentary records and testimonies that survived in private letters, what happened within those walls was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Springfield, Illinois, in 1872, stood as a growing industrial city, still bearing the scars of the Civil War that had ended just 7 years prior. The population swelled with veterans, freed slaves seeking new lives, and immigrants drawn by railroad work and factory jobs. It was a time of rapid change and loose oversight, when powerful men could build empires with little scrutiny from distant authorities. Cinder Hollow Prison rose from the muddy outskirts of Springfield like a monument to human misery. Built in 1868 with dark limestone quarried from nearby bluffs, the fortress-like structure housed nearly 300 inmates in conditions that would have shocked even the most hardened observers. The prison took its name from the hollow where it sat, a depression in the earth that locals claimed had been scorched by a massive fire decades earlier, leaving the soil perpetually black and barren. Warden Samuel Cinder, a man whose surname proved eerily prophetic, had arrived in Springfield in 1870 with impeccable credentials and letters of recommendation from influential politicians in Chicago. Tall and gaunt, with piercing grey eyes and a meticulously waxed mustache, Cinder carried himself with the bearing of a military officer, though his actual service record remained mysteriously vague. He spoke in measured tones and dressed in fine black suits that made him look more like an undertaker than a prison administrator. Dr. Theodore Mills had taken the position of prison physician in the autumn of 1871, drawn by promises of steady pay and the opportunity to serve society. A graduate of Rush Medical College in Chicago, Mills was an idealistic young man who believed in rehabilitation and humane treatment of prisoners. His thick brown hair and earnest blue eyes reflected an optimism that would soon be tested by the realities of Cinder Hollow. The prison operated under what Cinder called progressive discipline, a system he claimed would extract confessions and reform criminal behavior through psychological pressure rather than physical punishment. The inmates, a mixture of petty thieves, army deserters, political dissidents, and men whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, lived in narrow cells that measured 6 feet by 8 feet, with a single barred window that provided just enough light to read by during midday hours. On the night of November 17th, 1872, Dr. Mills was conducting his usual evening rounds when he first heard them, the whispers that would haunt his sleep for months to come. As he walked past the East Wing cells, carrying his medical bag and a kerosene lantern, he noticed several prisoners pressed against their cell doors, listening intently to sounds coming from within the walls themselves. "Doctor," called out James Morrison, a railroad worker convicted of theft, "do you hear them voices? They've been talking all night, confessing to things I never done." Morrison's weathered face was pale with fear, his calloused hands gripping the iron bars until his knuckles turned white. Mills paused, setting down his lantern and pressing his ear against the stone wall. At first, he heard nothing but the usual prison sounds: distant coughing, the scurrying of rats, and the wind whistling through cracks in the masonry. Then, just as he was about to dismiss Morrison's concerns, he heard it. A faint, distorted voice speaking in hushed tones about a murder in Chicago, providing details that chilled his blood. The voice described how the victim had been found in an alley behind a textile factory, stabbed 3 times in the chest with a bone-handled knife. It recounted the killer's escape route through the stockyards and mentioned specific streets that Mills recognized from his time studying in Chicago. But what disturbed him most was the voice itself. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Word of the whispers spread through the prison like wildfire. Prisoners began reporting that they could hear confessions to crimes spanning Illinois and beyond: bank robberies in Peoria, murders in Quincy, political assassinations in Chicago. Some claimed to recognize their own voices confessing to crimes they insisted they had never committed, while others heard detailed admissions of guilt for offenses that had puzzled law enforcement for years. Warden Cinder dismissed the reports as the hallucinations of desperate men seeking attention or attempting to lay groundwork for appeals. "Prisoners are notorious for their creative storytelling, Doctor," he told Mills during their weekly meeting in his oak-paneled office. "I suggest you focus on their physical ailments and leave their mental delusions to me." In the weeks following the first reports of whispered confessions, Cinder Hollow transformed into a place of perpetual unease. Prisoners who had once filled their days with card games and conversations now spent hours in silence, straining to catch fragments of the mysterious voices. Sleep became elusive as men lay awake, listening to confessions that seemed to emerge from the very stones around them. Dr. Mills began keeping detailed notes on the phenomenon, documenting times, locations, and the specific content of confessions that prisoners claimed to hear. His medical training had taught him to observe and record, and something about the consistency of the reports troubled him deeply. These weren't the random ravings of madmen. They were specific, detailed, and often concerned crimes that had actually occurred. The whispers followed a pattern. They began each night at 11:15 and continued until dawn, always emanating from the walls of the East Wing, where the newest prisoners were housed. The confessions were always spoken in the same flat, emotionless tone, as if the speakers were reciting from memory rather than unburdening their souls. Most disturbing of all, several prisoners swore they could hear their own voices among the confessions, admitting to crimes they vehemently denied committing. Thomas Hartwell, a young man imprisoned for political dissent after criticizing the railroad companies in a local newspaper, became obsessed with documenting what he heard. Using smuggled paper and ink, he transcribed dozens of confessions, creating a detailed catalogue of unsolved crimes across the Midwest. His transcriptions revealed an unsettling truth. Many of the confessions contained information that only law enforcement or the actual perpetrators should have known. Meanwhile, Dr. Mills noticed changes in Warden Cinder's behavior. The usually punctual administrator began keeping irregular hours, often arriving at the prison well before dawn and remaining long after the evening shift ended. Mills frequently saw light burning in Cinder's office during the early morning hours, and on several occasions he observed the warden emerging from the prison's basement, which housed the boiler room and storage areas that were supposedly off-limits to all but maintenance staff. Dr. Mills's investigation took on new urgency when he received an unexpected visitor in February 1873. Margaret Hartwell, Thomas's sister, had traveled from Chicago to inquire about her brother's condition. During their meeting in the prison's sparse visiting room, she mentioned something that sent chills down Mills's spine. "My brother wrote to me about voices he's been hearing," she said, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. "He claims one of them was confessing to the murder of Samuel Brennan, a politician who was killed in Chicago last autumn. But doctor, the confession contained details that were never published in any newspaper. Details that only the killer or someone with access to police files would know. Margaret explained that her late husband had been a police detective in Chicago, and she had maintained contacts within the force. According to her sources, the Brennan murder investigation had uncovered evidence that was deliberately withheld from the press to help identify the real killer. Yet somehow, the voice that Thomas heard in his cell had recounted these exact details with perfect accuracy. This revelation prompted Mills to take a more systematic approach to his investigation. He began requesting detailed records of prisoner interrogations from Warden Cinder, claiming he needed them to better understand the mental state of inmates for his medical reports. Cinder initially resisted, but Mills persisted, arguing that proper medical care required understanding the psychological pressures that prisoners faced during questioning. When Mills finally received access to interrogation records, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. The files contained transcripts of confessions that matched exactly what prisoners claimed to hear in the whispered voices. More troubling still, many of these confessions had been obtained through sessions that lasted 12 to 18 hours, conducted in the basement interrogation room that Mills had never been permitted to visit. The records showed a disturbing pattern. Prisoners would be brought to the basement for intensive questioning and would emerge hours later having confessed not only to the crimes that brought them to Cinder Hollow, but to numerous additional offenses across Illinois and neighboring states. These confessions were meticulously detailed and often implicated prominent citizens, business leaders, and politicians in various criminal enterprises. Dr. Mills's growing suspicions reached a breaking point on a frigid March evening when he decided to conduct an unauthorized investigation of the prison's basement. Using a spare key he had obtained from the maintenance supervisor, an elderly man named Patrick O'Brien who had grown suspicious of Warden Cinder's secretive activities, Mills descended into the depths of Cinder Hollow after the evening shift had ended. The basement was a maze of stone corridors that seemed to extend far beyond what the prison's above-ground footprint would suggest. Mills's flickering lantern cast dancing shadows on walls that sweated with moisture and seemed to pulse with the building's heartbeat. Following the sound of dripping water and the distant hum of machinery, he discovered something that defied explanation. Hidden behind what appeared to be a storage room for coal, Mills found an elaborate network of speaking tubes, metal pipes that connected various points throughout the prison like a primitive communication system. The tubes converged in a central chamber where a large mechanical device sat surrounded by dozens of wax cylinders, each carefully labeled with dates, names, and crime descriptions. The device was unlike anything Mills had seen before, though he recognized it as an advanced version of Edison's phonograph, which had been demonstrated publicly just a few years earlier. Someone had modified the machine to play back recordings through the tube network, distributing sound to specific cells throughout the prison. The wax cylinders contained the source of the whispered confessions, recordings of actual prisoner interrogations conducted in this very basement. As Mills examined the setup more closely, he heard footsteps echoing through the corridors above. Panic seized him as he realized that someone was entering the prison. Moving quickly but quietly, he extinguished his lantern and concealed himself behind a stack of coal bins, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would give away his position. Warden Cinder descended into the basement, carrying a bright kerosene lamp and a leather satchel. Mills watched in horror as the warden checked the phonograph mechanism, replaced one of the wax cylinders, and adjusted settings on the speaking tube network. Cinder worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks countless times before. The full scope of Warden Cinder's operation became clear to Dr. Mills as he continued his covert observation. Hidden in the basement shadows, he watched as Cinder retrieved a detailed logbook and began making entries next to names that Mills recognized as prominent Illinois politicians, judges, and business leaders. The book appeared to contain a systematic catalogue of compromising information that could be used for blackmail and political manipulation. Cinder's scheme was diabolically elegant in its cruelty. Using sophisticated interrogation techniques that combined sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and carefully applied physical discomfort, he had been extracting false confessions from prisoners. These men, desperate to end their suffering, would eventually admit to any crime Cinder suggested, providing detailed accounts of murders, thefts, and conspiracies that they had never committed. The warden then used these recorded confessions as evidence to implicate powerful figures throughout Illinois in various criminal activities. Politicians who opposed certain legislation would suddenly find themselves linked to unsolved murders through prisoner confessions. Business leaders who refused to cooperate with railroad expansion plans would be connected to theft rings by men who had never met them. Judges who proved insufficiently compliant would discover that convicted criminals were confessing to crimes that implicated the judge's family members or close associates. The midnight playback of these recordings served multiple purposes. It psychologically tormented the prisoners by forcing them to hear their own coerced words, breaking down their mental resistance for future interrogations. It also served as a twisted form of advertisement, demonstrating to new arrivals the detailed confessions that Cinder could extract from anyone. Most importantly, it provided Cinder with a convenient excuse for any prisoner who might later recant their confession. Officials could dismiss such retractions as the ravings of men driven mad by guilt and confinement. Mills realized that he was witnessing the operation of a political machine that used human suffering as its fuel. Cinder had transformed Cinder Hollow from a prison into a factory for producing false evidence and compromising material. The warden's mysterious background and impressive credentials suddenly made sense. He was likely an agent of powerful interests who needed a reliable source of fabricated evidence to maintain control over Illinois politics during the tumultuous Reconstruction era. The doctor's blood turned to ice when he observed Cinder consulting a list of upcoming prisoners scheduled for transfer to Cinder Hollow. Mills recognized several names on the list, including political reformers, journalists who had been investigating corruption, and business leaders who had opposed certain development projects. These men weren't being sent to Cinder Hollow for punishment. They were being delivered for processing into Cinder's confession factory. Dr. Mills faced an impossible choice as he crouched in the coal-stained darkness of Cinder Hollow's basement. Exposing Warden Cinder's operation would require evidence that he had obtained through illegal means, and the network of corruption extended so high into Illinois politics that he couldn't be certain whom to trust. Moreover, Cinder's careful documentation suggested that he had compromising material on officials throughout the state government. The doctor chose a careful path forward. Rather than attempting to expose the entire conspiracy at once, he began documenting everything he had observed and making discreet inquiries among his professional contacts in Chicago. Through a former colleague at Rush Medical College, he learned that similar operations were suspected at prisons in other states, suggesting that Cinder's facility was part of a larger network of political manipulation. Mills also began providing better medical care to prisoners who had undergone intensive interrogation, treating them for the physical and psychological trauma that Cinder's methods inflicted. He couldn't prevent the interrogations, but he could help men recover their strength and mental clarity, making them less susceptible to future coercion. The whispered confessions continued nightly, but now Mills understood their true purpose. Each recording represented not just a false confession, but the destruction of a human being's dignity and sanity in service of political power. The men of Cinder Hollow were not just prisoners, they were raw material being processed into weapons for use against Cinder's enemies. Thomas Hartwell, the young journalist whose sister had first alerted Mills to the significance of the confessions, became an ally in documenting the prison's crimes. Together, they compiled detailed records of confessions, interrogation schedules, and the suspicious pattern of prisoner transfers that brought specific individuals to Cinder Hollow just before major political decisions were made in Springfield. Just when Dr. Mills thought he understood the full scope of the horror at Cinder Hollow, the investigation took an even darker turn. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Give it a like to support our investigation into America's hidden past, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the shocking conclusion. Let's uncover together what Mills discovered in those final, terrifying weeks at the prison. The end came suddenly in April 1873, when federal authorities arrived at Cinder Hollow as part of a broader investigation into prison conditions across the Midwest. Dr. Mills had managed to get word to reformers in Washington through his medical network, providing them with enough evidence to warrant official scrutiny. However, by the time investigators arrived, Warden Cinder had vanished, taking with him the most incriminating evidence of his operation. The basement chamber was found stripped of its sophisticated recording equipment, though investigators discovered the speaking tube network and enough documentation to piece together the basic structure of Cinder's scheme. Many of the prisoners who had been subjected to intensive interrogation were found to be suffering from severe psychological trauma, though few could provide coherent testimony about their experiences. The investigation revealed that at least 47 men had died at Cinder Hollow during Cinder's tenure, officially from various illnesses, but actually from the physical and psychological torture used to extract confessions. These deaths had been carefully documented as natural causes by the prison's previous physician, who investigators discovered had been dismissed shortly before Dr. Mills's arrival. In the end, the truth about Cinder Hollow demonstrated how easily institutions designed to serve justice could be perverted into instruments of oppression. The prison's legacy serves as a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice individual dignity for political power. This mystery reveals the terrifying efficiency with which human suffering can be systematized and weaponized. The whispered confessions of Cinder Hollow weren't the voices of the guilty seeking redemption. They were the echoes of the innocent being tortured into complicity with their own destruction. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe that such operations could exist without detection in our modern era? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to explore more hidden stories from America's past, subscribe to Dark Heritage Files, activate notifications, and share this video with fellow seekers of truth. Until next time, remember that the most chilling horrors are often hidden in plain sight.